By 3000 BC, the world's first civilization developed in Mesopotamia. They didn't refer to themselves as Mesopotamians. In fact, they referred to themselves as... I'm not even going to try. But it means black-headed people. Today, we refer to these people as the Sumerians. In our last video, we discussed the geography of Mesopotamia and how it influenced settlement in the region. Today, we are returning to the land between the rivers to discuss the first civilization to settle there, the Sumerians. By around 3000 BC, you had numerous settlements around Mesopotamia. Some examples of these are Uruk, and Nippur. Remember, a city-state is like a mini country with one city and the land surrounding it. So the more powerful your army was, the more land your city-state controlled. So Uruk had its own government that made decisions for Uruk, and Nippur had its own government that made decisions for Nippur, but the two governments didn't make decisions for each other. As these civilizations developed and interacted with each other, they started to look very similar to each other. For example, both Nippur and Uruk had a monarchy, which is a government ruled by a king. But it's important to remember that they are independent. They're not one country. So let's take a look at what life in a Sumerian city-state would have looked like in a city-state like Ur. First of all, the Sumerians were a deeply religious people. Religion was important to all parts of Sumerian life, and the Sumerians had many different gods. By the way, the belief in more than one god is called polytheism. Somebody who believes in more than one god is polytheistic. Some of the gods the Sumerians had were Enlil, god of the air, Enki, god of wisdom, and Inanna, god of love and war. It's important to realize that these gods could either build a city up or destroy it. So it was very important to Sumerians that they made these gods happy. One story tells about how the Sumerians were partying too loud one night and woke the gods up from sleep, and so the gods sent a flood to destroy the partiers. As you can imagine, this made the people responsible for talking to the gods very powerful. In fact, the only people more powerful than priests in Mesopotamia were the kings. Priests made offerings to the gods in great temples on top of pyramid-like structures called ziggurats. And Sumerian cities were centered around this ziggurat. As mentioned before, there was several class distinctions in Mesopotamian society. At the top, you had kings. Kings were the most powerful in Mesopotamian society. Underneath the kings, you had priests. Then you had craftspeople and merchants. Underneath that, you had farmers. And finally, at the bottom of the social structure, you had slaves. We call this system where some people have more power than other people social hierarchy. And you're going to hear about social hierarchies in most of the civilizations we study this year. While we are talking about social status, let's talk about men and women. Men would work. They could be priests, kings, workers. They were in charge of the politics of the city, running the city. Women, on the other hand, were in charge of the home. They would take care of the kids. They would make sure the house was clean. They would run the slaves. And this is something we will see in the other civilizations we study this year. So Sumer. Why do we talk about Sumer in middle school? They did a lot of really cool stuff. For example, they invented writing. So you have the Sumerians to thank for being in my class. Writing's a very important thing through society. You go to school to learn to read and write. The first writing system developed by the Sumerians was called cuneiform. The way you wrote cuneiform was you had a stylus that you would press into clay to make different wedge-shaped symbols. Writing probably did not develop so that people could write love letters to each other, not to mention breakup letters. Writing developed so that people could keep track of the stuff they owned and the stuff they sold. Most people did not know how to read and write, which created another class distinction between people. And again, typically, women didn't go to school. And if the more powerful people knew how to write, you can imagine what that did for the status of women. Another Mesopotamian invention was taxes. Taxes are a really useful way to pay for the things governments want to do. So for example, if you want to build a wall around your city, you have to pay for that wall. You have to pay the people to build it, pay for the materials. One way to pay for that stuff is to charge the people living in your city a fee or a tax. Another thing taxes pay for is the army, something Mesopotamian kings like to use fairly frequently. One type of tax in Mesopotamia that didn't involve giving up some of your stuff was called the burden. The burden required male citizens to give up time working for the city, maybe digging irrigation ditches, maybe building roads, maybe building temples. So this type of tax was different in that you didn't have to give up grain or money, you just had to give up your time. In addition to these two very important achievements by the Mesopotamian, writing and taxes, Mesopotamians also did a lot of other cool stuff. They invented the wheel, bronze tools and weapons. They had advances in math, including base 60. What does that mean? Well, if you think about the way we tell time today, there are 60 seconds in 1 minute, 60 minutes in 1 hour. They also broke the circle into 360 degrees. They investigated rectangles and triangles. Their art and statues were pretty awesome. They created pots, jewelry, and music. Some of the instruments they had were drums, tambourines, and lyres. Lyre? Lyre. Lyre.
Lyre.
Lyre. And these are all things that influence our life today. And of course, don't forget the first cities. The Sumerians were a huge influence in Mesopotamia for 3,000 years, and they would influence civilizations that came after them. In fact, we're going to take a look at some of these other civilizations in a later video. But just remember, the Sumerians were the first. Were you paying attention? Answer the next couple of questions to find out. Why is ancient Sumer not considered a country? What was Sumer's social hierarchy? Why were priests so powerful? What were the Sumerian achievements discussed in the video? Which do you think is the most important?